They said the screams were just echoes of prayer, but echoes don't leave blood in the snow. You were never meant to hear this. Not the names, not the rituals, and certainly not the truth buried beneath stone and scripture. But you're here now, and once this begins, there is no unknowing it. In the deep pine wilderness of 18th century Maine, before statehood, before maps had meaning, there was a building that didn't appear on records, a fortress disguised as a convent. 3 women arrived with forged letters and infinite gold, claiming piety, but wielding power few dared question. They called themselves Ashford, but their bloodline whispered older names in secret, names tied to medieval guilds of anatomical dissection, clandestine healing cults, and the hidden chapters of the Inquisition's darkest books. The land they purchased wasn't random, it had history. Forgotten villages, mass disappearances, and soil soaked in something no seeds would grow in. Locals thought it cursed. The Ashfords called it sanctified. What followed was not a convent. It was a machine, built for silence, discipline, and transformation. Women were sent there by fathers and husbands hoping to fix the disobedient. Wives who read too much, daughters who bled before marriage, sisters who questioned scripture. They entered through iron gates under the sign, "Rejoice, for tears cleanse the soul." Fewer than half returned, and those who did were not the same, their laughter gone, their voices hushed, eyes that never looked directly at the sky again. One doctor called it miraculous healing, another called it the final erasure of the feminine will. But tonight, we're going deeper. Deeper than the stories told in fearful whispers, deeper than what the archived journals dared admit. You'll see what Thomas Brewster saw in that frost-covered basement window, what Deacon Morrison felt in his bones couldn't voice, and why the state of Maine sealed all records for over a century. This is not just a tale of madness cloaked in scripture, it is the anatomy of control, the psychology of obedience, and the architecture of generational manipulation carved into American soil. Every cult has a founder, every ritual, a design, and every darkness, a family name that survives it. Ashford, welcome to your descent. They didn't choose the wilderness by accident, no power ever does. True transformation, the kind that breaks the soul and remakes it, requires isolation, not just from civilization but from memory itself. The Ashford women understood this. They weren't simply building a convent, they were constructing a system, a closed loop of cause and correction, resistance and reformation. It began with silence. Upon arrival, each woman was stripped, not just of her possessions, but of her name, replaced by a number, a color, a symbol. One survivor, who spoke only once before disappearing, described her intake process as unbirth. The moment she entered those stone doors, she was no longer a daughter, wife, or sister. She was an experiment in human will. The Ashfords called it the vessel doctrine, a belief that a woman's soul, like a chalice, must be emptied of corruption before divine order can pour in. But their definition of corruption was precise. Curiosity, autonomy, ambition, any trace of intellectual independence. Sister Prudence kept the records, etched in codes on waxed parchment, later hidden beneath floorboards sealed with ash and lye. These weren't medical files, they were behavioral matrices. Charts tracking how long it took to break each woman's sense of self. The average was 37 days, some resisted longer. Those women never left. Temperance, the youngest, was the first to speak to the girls. Her voice, calm, hypnotic, would lull them into false safety before the ritual began. "Let go," she would say. "Only the unshaped can be blessed." Survivors say her eyes never blinked when she said it. The basement, what they called the womb, was where the doctrine became flesh. Surgical tables disguised as altars, implements imported from European sanatoria, some so precise they wouldn't be invented officially for another 50 years. These weren't exorcisms, they were near-you, rological modifications, calibrated pain and suggestion designed to erase cognitive resistance, a complete neurological reset masked as salvation. But here's what most historians miss. This wasn't insanity. It was design. The Ashfords weren't madwomen. They were scholars of silence, architects of submission, and what they built was so efficient, so quiet, so terrifyingly effective that other institutions began to take notice. By 1811, similar Reformation retreats began appearing across the American Northeast, each with eerie similarities in structure, in staff, in silence. Coincidence or replication? Understand this. The Ashford model wasn't just a family secret, it became a prototype. And like all prototypes, it was tested. The first confirmed death was never recorded in the convent's registry. Her name was Margaret Heller, though inside the stone walls she was simply Subject 3A. She arrived from Salem in the spring of 1804, a schoolteacher, 29 years old, educated, articulate, and worst of all, unmarried by choice. Her father, a deacon of the local Presbyterian church, sent her to the Ashfords with a single note: "Her mind is too full, empty her." For the first 6 days, Margaret was kept in what they called reflection isolation, a lightless chamber designed to erase time perception. No sound, no warmth, meals slid through a hatch. Her only visitor, Temperance, who sat silently in the dark beside her, sometimes for hours, breathing in rhythm until Margaret's sense of self began to distort. On the 7th day, the screaming began, but it wasn't fear, it was confusion. She no longer remembered her own name. She asked to go home but didn't know where that was. She couldn't recall her mother's face. She begged to be forgiven for sins she could no longer name. That night, she was taken to the womb. What happened next was preserved, not in town records, but in a hidden codex recovered years later beneath the floorboards of the Ashford parlor, written in a cipher derived from an old Carthusian prayer dialect. It described Procedure 12, cerebral reintegration through electropenitence. They placed a silver diadem across her scalp, inserted copper filaments along her frontal bone, and with a hand-cranked generator smuggled in from a London laboratory, delivered controlled charges while reciting psalms, each shock timed with phrases like, "I am the Lord's vessel," and "empty so that I may be filled." She seized, convulsed, bit through her own tongue, but they recorded the data calmly, noting muscle response, eye dilation, vocal patterns. When she stopped breathing, they didn't paw. Nick, they observed. Temperance noted in the margin, subject achieved stillness, outcome acceptable. They buried her in the orchard behind the convent, no name, no marker, just a shallow grave among 17 others. The soil there is still dead. Margaret wasn't the last, but she was the first whose mind they couldn't fully erase without breaking the body. They adjusted after that, refined their tools, and soon no one died, at least not in ways you could measure with a pulse, because death wasn't their goal, it was obedience, and obedience is far more permanent. There's a difference between obedience and surrender. Surrender is emotional, temporary, born of fear or fatigue, but obedience, true obedience, is a rewiring of the will, a cold, permanent alignment to power, and the Ashfords understood that better than any man of their era. By 1806, their methods had evolved into something far more precise. No more screaming, no more blood on the stones. What had begun as surgical conversion had matured into full psychological engineering. They no longer needed blades to break women. They could use mirrors, music, and repetition. Inside the convent, the women were assigned mirrors of reflection, small silver discs they were required to stare into for hours each day. The reflections, slightly warped, created subtle distortions in facial recognition over time. Survivors described the sensation of forgetting my own face, as if their identity were unspooling one hair at a time. Scripture was weaponized, not taught, but embedded, not read, but memorized to the point of muttering in sleep. They were made to write the same verse 500 times a day in silence. I am not mine, I am the work of holy hands. It wasn't penance, it was programming. And the prayers, oh, the prayers, they were sung in unison, in minor keys that looped endlessly, harmonic phrasing designed to mimic theta brainwave frequencies. It wasn't worship, it was trance induction. One former resident, decades later, still woke up at night humming a chant she hadn't heard in 50 years. But the brilliance of the Ashford system wasn't just its cruelty, it was its elegance. They created an environment where trauma became sacred and suffering was salvation. Pain was never inflicted directly. Instead, they made the women inflict it on themselves. Confession chambers were lined with iron benches heated from beneath. Women would sit until their flesh blistered, believing it, would purify their sinful thoughts. They were never ordered, just suggested, whispered, modeled by others. It was a cult, yes, but not of devotion, of control, and it worked. By 1808, local families praised the Ashfords for restoring nearly 100 women, their eyes now downcast, their speech reduced to whispers, their independence replaced by a terrifying calm. But here's the truth, they never told their donors. Once a woman was restored, she never left the grounds unsupervised again, because the Reformation was never meant to end. It was a cycle, and cycles are how empires begin. In the spring of 1809, something changed. Not within the convent, but around it. Local farmers began reporting strange occurrences in the forests surrounding the Ashford property. Animals found mutilated yet untouched by predators, crops withering in concentric rings, children waking in the night speaking in voices not their own. At first it was dismissed as folklore, rural minds weaving fear from shadows, but then the dreams began. Shared dreams, repeating symbols, entire families waking with identical words burned into their memory. The womb has opened. It was the same phrase that appeared encoded in the Ashford's journal the week Margaret Heller died. Coincidence or resonance? That year, the convent held its first pilgrimage of redemption, an invitation-only gathering for clergy, physicians, and elite patrons from Boston and Philadelphia. The Ashfords claimed it was a celebration of spiritual healing, but no official documentation of the event exists. Only a single account, written in a letter never sent, found decades later in the attic of a Harvard theologian who disappeared the same year. It read, "They sang without mouths. The walls pulsed like lungs. I swear by all sacred things, I heard Latin spoken backwards, and yet I understood every word." What occurred during those 3 nights is still unclear, but what followed was undeniable. The Ashfords expanded. 3 new buildings were constructed along the eastern border of their land, each with underground passages connecting back to the womb. They called them Chambers of Purity. From that point forward, the women brought in for treatment no longer came from local villages. They came from cities, escorted by men in black coats with university seals and foreign accents, European nobility, American industrialists, always men of means, always with problematic female relations, and they paid not with coal in but with favors, influence, and silence. In return, the Ashfords offered more than obedience. They promised erasure, not just of behavior, but of memory, of resistance, of soul. This is where the story begins to fracture, because the records stop aligning. Some say the Ashfords had discovered early forms of chemical lobotomy. Others claim they invoked something older than science, rituals buried in Templar vaults and pre-Christian catacombs. But this is not speculation. In 1810, a woman named Lydia Coyle escaped. She had been missing for 4 years, declared dead, buried symbolically by her family. She came back, and she remembered. And what she remembered would threaten to destroy everything. Lydia Coyle walked into the center of Millbridge on a Thursday morning with bare feet, tangled hair, and blood that wasn't hers soaked into the seams of her dress. She didn't speak for 3 days. Sheriff Mallory took her in. He'd known Lydia since she was a child, remembered when she used to recite Shakespeare in church plays and quote Rousseau in tavern debates. But the woman who now sat trembling in his custody barely blinked. She flinched at the sound of her own name. On the 4th day, she spoke just one sentence. "The Ashfords are not human." The physician who examined her noted signs of long-term confinement, muscle atrophy, dental damage from prolonged gagging, pupils that didn't respond properly to light. She was 27 but looked 40. When they asked where she'd been, she said, "Underneath, always underneath." Pressed for details, she described corridors beneath the convent that didn't appear on any blueprints. She spoke of black stairs that spiraled downward into rooms lined with iron panels and walls that dripped a clear, bitter-smelling oil. But it wasn't the architecture that disturbed the sheriff, it was the names. Lydia whispered them in sleep, names of women who'd vanished decades before, long thought dead or run away. And she described their faces in perfect detail. Women like Ruth Merriweather, who'd been institutionalized in 1789, or Hannah Leeds, a minister's wife who disappeared during a sermon and was never seen again. She even described the marks, symbols carved into their skin just beneath the collarbone, 3 intersecting circles forming a triangle. Sheriff Mallory, skeptical, sketched the symbol in his journal. He showed it to Deacon Morrison. The old man turned pale. "It's a sign of the ancient watchers," Morrison whispered. "It was found in an ossuary beneath Montségur after the Cathar purge. No Christian should know it." But Lydia knew. She also knew what they did to the mind. She described a process called divine sequencing, where the subject was broken into 3 parts: body, will, and name. Each part was isolated, reprogrammed, then reassembled under supervision. The new version of the woman had no memory of pain, only loyalty. "They made us love them," Lydia sobbed, "even while they took us apart." Sheriff Mallory tried to file a report, but 2 men from Augusta arrived before the ink was dry. Federal men dressed too well for the frontier. They took Lydia. No warrant, no explanation. She was never seen again. The report disappeared, but the symbol remained. What do you call a lie so old it becomes the foundation of truth? By 1811, the Ashford name had spread beyond Maine, not in newspapers. No, they avoided those. But in sealed letters, in private recommendations, in whispered suggestions passed between powerful men over brandy and cigars. "She needs an Ashford cure," they would say. And like a secret password, it opened doors. What began as a religious retreat had become something more, an institution of behavioral correction tailored for the upper class, a silent engine of control disguised as piety. But here's what they never admitted. By this time, the Ashfords had ceased aging. The townsfolk noticed it first. Prudence, the one with the alabaster hands, looked exactly the same as she had on the day she arrived nearly 13 years before. No graying hair, no softening of the skin. And Agatha, her bearing as regal, her eyes as sharp. No tremor in her hands, no stoop in her spine. Some said it was just good breeding, others whispered of witchcraft. But one man, Dr. Elias Grover, a botanist from Salem, was not content with whispers. He had lost a niece to the convent in 1807 and never believed the official story of mental collapse. Grover posed as a traveling cleric, gaining entry to the convent under the guise of researching European herb lore for theological integration. He stayed 3 days. What he wrote afterward would never be published, but the manuscript, known as the Grover Testament, was hidden in a false compartment beneath the chapel of his family estate and recovered in 1912 by his descendants. In it, Grover details observing a locked greenhouse adjacent to the convent, filled with bioluminescent plants not native to North America, species he recognized from restricted French botanical journals, including one believed extinct since 1624. The plants emitted spores, airborne. He noticed that the sister spent hours among them, breathing, meditating. Grover described a ritual, once a month, under the new moon, where the sisters consumed a tonic derived from the root of one such plant. He called it the breath of stillness. Within an hour, their pupils would dilate to near blackness, and they'd enter what he described as a living coma, awake but without ego. They'd lie side by side, still, silent, waiting. Waiting for what, Grover never discovered. Because on the third night he was found. Stripped of his false identity, he was brought before Agatha. She didn't punish him. She simply smiled. "You've seen too much to leave, Dr. Grover," she whispered, "but not enough to understand." Dr. Elias Grover was never reported missing. His estate was quietly transferred to a distant cousin. No investigation followed, because those who came too close to the Ashfords didn't just disappear. They were rewritten. There's evidence, scattered, nearly erased, that Grover remained within the convent's walls for years. Not as a prisoner, as a participant. A letter smuggled out by a traveling supply merchant in 1814 refers cryptically to a brother Elias, leading new mourning rites and conducting studies on emotive suppression in conditioned females. The handwriting matched Grover's. But the tone was not his own. This is what the Ashfords perfected. Not murder, not madness. Assimilation. They didn't silence their enemies, they repurposed them, bent them into the machine, and they were rewarded for it. Donations surged. Endorsements from European churches arrived, subtle, hidden in symbology and coded Latin blessings, and most chilling of all, an official charter from the Massachusetts Provincial Council recognizing the convent as an authorized center for restorative doctrine. Legitimacy. But underneath that polished exterior, something else had begun to awaken. A shift in the sisters' behavior. Townsfolk observed them walking at night, barefoot, in silence, three abreast, always the same formation, always the same rhythm, and always toward the forest. No torches, no weapons, just long, deliberate steps into blackness. Those who followed never got closer than 50 paces before something forced them to stop. Nausea, blindness, nosebleeds, and in one case a young man named Edwin Dorsey collapsed entirely, his left eye hemorrhaging as he screamed the word fractal over and over until he passed out. He never spoke again. What were they doing out there? Theories range from ritual communion to communication with pre-human intelligences. But one recovered. Map, drawn by a hunter who claimed to find strange carvings in the rocks near the Ashford border, may hold the clue. A spiral, overlaid with coordinates matching not stars but human brain regions, neurological geography. The Ashfords weren't just rewriting women, they were mapping the mind, using trauma, repetition, light, sound, geometry, memory collapse, rebuild, collapse again. Every woman, every ritual, a test, a keyhole, and when the pattern held, they opened the door. But the question is, to what? Because after 1815, something emerged, a presence that wasn't bound to the convent anymore, a whisper that began traveling, a seed planted in the minds of men. It was no longer just about control, it was about contagion. It started with the dreams. At first they came only to the women who had returned from the convent, those who were reformed, as the Ashfords put it, but soon husbands began reporting strange behavior, wives who stared for hours at blank walls, who whispered in their sleep in languages they never knew, who scratched spirals into the wooden frames of their beds until their fingers bled. Then the men started dreaming too. Always the same sequence, a black spiral turning clockwise, a door of white stone opening inward, a voice, not loud but inside, speaking in a slow surgical tone, "You are not yours." One man, a Boston magistrate whose wife had undergone a 3-month Ashford treatment, woke in the middle of the night and began reciting scripture backward in perfect Latin. He had never studied Latin. Another, a merchant from Portsmouth, was found in his study at dawn, naked, having scratched the Ashford mark, the 3 interlocking circles, into his own chest with a quill pen. They all claimed the same thing. She showed me the mirror. But none could explain who she was, or what the mirror revealed. And that's when the disappearances began. Not women this time. Men, judges, clerics, physicians. Each one had at some point referred a wife, sister or daughter to the Ashford convent. Each one had given consent, and now each one vanished. No signs of struggle, no notes, no final words. Just gone. As if the system that once demanded obedience had evolved into something that required sacrifice. Sheriff Mallory, the same man who tried to protect Lydia Coyle, grew obsessed with patterns. He collected documents, maps, even ripped pages from old church registries. He spoke of a feedback loop of penance, a spiritual virus that could travel thought to thought, dream to dream, a morality weapon masquerading as salvation. Before his sudden death ruled a heartache, he left one final note hidden in his fireplace. It read, "They are no longer reforming women, they are rewriting reality through them." The Ashfords had found something, or become something, and the more they practiced, the more the line between the convent and the world beyond began to dissolve. The rituals no longer needed stone walls. They had found a new sanctuary, the human mind. And if you're still watching, if you've made it this far, you're already standing at the threshold. You feel it, don't you? That pull behind your thoughts, that tension in your chest that says something is watching, not from the room, but from the inside. This is what the Ashfords mastered, not just obedience, not just erasure, infection. By 1817, the convent no longer needed messengers. It had become one, a living vessel of ideology, breathing, expanding, consuming, and every woman who left its gates was a carrier. Not of a disease, of a design. The women who returned home seemed calm, composed, devout, but within weeks their households changed. Husbands grew passive, children fell silent, servants refused to speak, the home itself shifted, rooms reorganized, mirrors removed, books burned without explanation. Each family became a node in a wider pattern, and the pattern grew. A Harvard professor of metaphysics, Dr. Ian Hargrave, was the first to publish a warning. In 1818, he delivered a lecture titled "Doctrine as Contagion: The Psychological Mechanics of Ritualized Control." He spoke of a hidden structure buried in repeated religious symbols across Ashford Reformed families, geometry encoded into language, obedience encoded into posture. He concluded with a phrase that chilled the room: "If this continues, we will not need chains to be slaves." The paper was never published. Hargrave was institutionalized within the month. Diagnosis: psychotic break via excessive symbol exposure. But a letter he scribbled on the back of a census form survives. It reads, "They don't convert you. They get inside the part of you that wants to belong, and they bloom." This was the final evolution. The Ashfords stopped breaking minds. They started replacing them, not with technology, not with magic, with ideology engineered so precisely that it bypassed reason entirely. A spiritual algorithm, a virus of thought. It spread through eye contact, through repetition. Thurs, rough, unquestioned phrases repeated at just the right pitch, in just the right light. Through prayers that weren't prayers at all, but scripts. And the terrifying part, it worked because it didn't feel evil, it felt holy, it felt right. And that's what makes it unstoppable. If you're listening to this, you may already feel something shift, a quiet echo in your thoughts. Now listen carefully. If you're still the man you were when this video began, comment below twice. "I do not belong to them." Say it twice. Speak it out loud. Lock it in. Because once we pass the halfway point, there's no coming back. Now we descend deeper, not just into history but into architecture. Because the Ashford convent wasn't just built, it was designed as a device. You were told it was a sanctuary, a home for penance. But blueprints recovered from a collapsed tunnel in 1903 tell another story. Drafted in ash ink and sealed beneath lead-pressed leather, they reveal floor plans unlike any religious site in the Western world. It wasn't a chapel. It was a machine. A psychological labyrinth engineered to dismantle identity and reconstruct it in controlled layers. The layout itself was patterned after ancient Babylonian memory temples. Corridors designed to disorient, right angles giving way to spirals, ascending stairs that led downward, dormitories with no doors from the inside. The structure taught submission before a single word was spoken, but that was just the surface. The womb, as the Ashfords called it, the heart of the entire structure, wasn't symbolic. It was literal. beneath 7 layers of stone, sealed behind a rotating iron disc, engraved with 72 characters matching Sumerian demonological glyphs, lay a room shaped like an inverted cathedral. Domed ceiling, no windows, and at its center, a pool. Not of water, of mercury, 6 feet across, perfectly still, surrounded by black glass panels etched with the faces of the reformed. This was not a room for punishment. This was a broadcast chamber. The Ashfords believed, no, they knew, that human consciousness could be imprinted with geometry, that suffering could be shaped into resonance, and that by placing a mind into perfect pattern, it could become a transmitter, not of sound, but of thought form. This is where procedures ended. This is where devotion began. Reformed women were brought here once in their lives, stripped of their names, their memories, and given a single instruction: lie down, breathe in, let go. No seek, Haynes. No screams, just silence. And when they emerged, they no longer asked what to do. They simply knew. What the Ashfords built wasn't just a place of healing. It was a signal tower for belief, one designed not to convert, but to rewrite, to reshape will at the molecular level, to transmit obedience not through force, but through certainty. That's how they escaped notice. Because no one resists what they believe they chose. What if I told you the Ashfords didn't invent this? What if I told you they inherited it? Because the truth, the one buried under centuries of burned scrolls and redacted letters, is this. The Ashford lineage didn't begin in Maine. It didn't begin in England. It began in Carthage. BC, a priestess order known as the Daughters of Tanit, women trained not in war, but in memory control. They didn't burn cities. They rewired kings. They were present at every treaty, every royal betrayal, every quiet suicide, disguised as honor. Then they vanished, or so we thought. But their rites, sigils for suppression, hymns for personality fragmentation, geometric triggers for trust bonding, they didn't disappear. They were encrypted, hidden in the margins of early Catholic texts, embedded in stained glass patterns across French cathedrals, disguised as spiritual exercises in medieval nunneries. And someone preserved them. That someone was Isadora Ashford, a scholar of dead languages, last seen alive in 1683 at the Benedictine Abbey of Reading. Her journals, discovered in 1841 behind a sealed crypt wall, tell the origin story the Ashford sisters never spoke aloud. They were not nuns. They were custodians. Guardians of an inheritance that predated Christianity, democracy, and science. A legacy built not on power, but on precision. The understanding that mind is architecture, and if you know how to build it, you never need to force it. Agatha, Prudence, and Temperance weren't merely sisters by blood. They were initiates in a lineage older than empire. Their arrival in America wasn't a mission of mercy, it was an expansion protocol. A new continent, a fresh population, minds ready for programming. They didn't bring Bibles, they brought scripts. And the womb? The mirror chambers, the rituals of silence and breath. All of it was pre-written, translated from Phoenician, tablets, refined in monastic chambers and perfected in the fires of war. This is why no government interfered. Because once you understand how to shape belief, you don't need weapons. You control nations by shaping the stories they obey. And the Ashfords? They wrote stories into the spine of America, and if you think they stopped in Maine, you're not ready for what comes next. In 1820, the Ashfords vanished. No fire, no war, no public scandal. One morning, a lumber crew passed by the convent grounds, and the buildings were empty. No sisters, no servants, no patients. Food sat rotting on trays, beds remained unmade, candles half burned, even the fires in the hearth still glowed faintly, but every door was open, every lock unlatched, the entire estate silent as a held breath. Sheriff Grafton, newly appointed and too young to understand what had truly lived behind those walls, led the search party, They combed the buildings room by room, eyes wide and rifles ready. What they found wasn't corpses, it was replication. Every room had been carefully duplicated, beds placed at identical angles, books arranged by spine color, portraits hung with precision measured in millimeters, and the dormitory mirrors, each etched with the same phrase along the top edge, "She is already you." The womb had been drained, the mercury gone, the black glass panels shattered. But one remained intact. Behind it, they found something that chilled even the most hardened among them. A second version of the convent, etched in silver, smaller, intricate. A model, perfectly to scale, of the entire estate, down to the precise curvature of each hallway, and inside this model, beneath its tiny cathedral dome, were tiny figurines of every woman who had ever entered. They weren't carved, they weren't molded, they were grown. Tissue samples confirmed human collagen, human hair, human enamel. Each figurine had a mouth, barely open, lips parted in a whisper. Their words, unheard, but the sound equipment brought by a Boston investigator seeking purely atmospheric data captured one frequency, repeating every 13 seconds. A woman's voice, layered in triplicate. "We left the building. We did not leave the system." They realized the truth too late. The convent wasn't abandoned. It had transferred. The rituals didn't need stone walls anymore. They had become portable. Portable in the minds of those reformed. Portable in scripts, in letters, in symbols. Portable in us, in our psychology, our schooling, our silence. This wasn't a cult. It was a prototype. And it worked. Because it convinced its victims to preserve it. Because the Ashford method didn't survive by hiding. It survived by being repeated. Over centuries, over generations, sometimes through religion, sometimes through medicine, but always with one goal: erasure without resistance. You were taught to believe that control wears a uniform, that it marches with flags, enforces with weapons, announces itself with brutality. But the Ashfords proved something far more dangerous. The most effective control feels like your own reflection. After the disappearance, local authorities tried to bury the story. Official records listed the convent as dissolved for lack of funding, but strange patterns continued to ripple outward. Towns across New England reported clusters of women exhibiting the same behaviors: quiet compliance, mechanical movement, an aversion to mirrors, and dreams of spirals. They were sleeper echoes, psychological clones of rituals long past, still broadcasting long after their origin point had gone dark. And yet, something shifted in 1822. A new name began appearing in shipping ledgers, real estate documents, and donation receipts across the Northeast. Ashford Behavioral Foundation, headquartered in Philadelphia, operated by a woman named Catherine Ashford. The signature matched Agatha's, exactly, no aging, no deviation. And the most haunting part? Philadelphia was now home to America's most modern asylum, St. Calder's Institute for Female Restoration. Identical structure, identical mission, but now government-funded. No one questioned the techniques, not when families could sign a paper, pay a fee, and erase a daughter's defiance forever. And as society industrialized, the Ashford method industrialized with it. Paperwork replaced prayers, chemistry replaced rituals, but the outcome stayed the same. And the womb. It returned, this time disguised as an echo chamber used for sensory therapy. Circular, steel-lined, isolated, patients entered agitated and emerged compliant. No scars, no trauma, just quiet. And here's what few understand. The Ashfords didn't just manipulate individuals, they designed systems, institutions that programmed compliance into the bones of society. Education, psychiatry, marriage, media, each bent gently, subtly toward a single purpose: to make rebellion feel unnatural. So what if I told you that when you chose silence in that moment, you should have spoken, when you doubted your gut and deferred to the script, when you felt like a failure for simply asking why? That wasn't weakness, that was conditioning, and its architect may have worn a habit in 1798, but today, She wears a white coat, or holds a gavel, or writes your training manual, because the Ashfords never vanished. They evolved. Let's cut deeper now. Because if you followed this far, you're not just hearing a story, you're waking up inside one. The Ashford method didn't just survive through institutions, it was transferred directly into modern governance, education, and self-help culture. The very systems that promise to liberate you are built on the architecture of silent submission. Let's start with language. Ever notice how you're told to reframe discomfort as growth, to trust the process, to believe that questioning authority is a sign of trauma, not insight? That's not encouragement. That's psychological pacification. That's Ashford coding. In the original convent doctrine, translated from the Daughters of Tanit tablets, the key to total control wasn't force, it was something far more surgical: identity detachment. It works like this. First, isolate, then confuse, then introduce a superior framework. The new order, one that offers relief from chaos, but only if the subject complies. Sound familiar? Therapists call it cognitive restructuring, educators call it behavioral alignment. Governments call it rehabilitation. The Ashfords called it soul remapping. Here's what they learned, and what our modern world inherited. A mind in pain will grasp for pattern, and if you control the pattern, you own the man. The spiral, remember? It's not just a shape, it's a directional trigger, used to draw attention inward, looping thought until it folds in on itself. The Ashfords used it on walls. Now it appears in corporate logos, military emblems, meditation apps. Coincidence? No. It's continuity. The same silent tools dressed in different robes. And you, yes, you, have likely performed Ashford protocols without ever knowing, repeating mantras you didn't write, sitting through training that made you question your instincts, punishing yourself for desiring freedom. That's but spiritual growth. That's voluntary programming. Because the final phase of the method wasn't suppression, it was internalization. The subject begins to self-administer the rituals. They believe compliance is virtue. They police others. They evangelize obedience. They become transmitters. You've met them. They quote slogans. They call rebellion toxicity. They flinch at original thought. And they sleep soundly at night, believing they are free. But you're still watching. That means something inside you didn't shut off. You heard the whisper, and you didn't look away, which means you're not one of them. Yet, there's a moment, one the Ashfords knew well, when the subject stops asking questions. That moment is the death of the self. It doesn't look like fear, it looks like relief. Relief from confusion, from contradiction, from choice. And once a man feels that relief, he's no longer dangerous, he's programmable. That's the stage they called the quieting, not silence from the outside, but silence within. A calm so total, so engineered, it's mistaken for peace. Modern psychology calls this adaptive compliance. But make no mistake, it's surrender, repackaged. You've felt it, haven't you? That moment in school when your question was met with a smile and no answer. That empty stare across the dinner table when you said, "This doesn't feel right." That slow, cold wave of doubt after clicking agree without reading the terms. It wasn't your fault. That's the beauty of the system. It trains you to blame yourself, and if you still think this is about a vanished convent in the woods, you haven't been listening. The Ashford method wasn't just adopted by modern institutions, it was the blueprint. In 1947, the Office of Naval Research funded Project Hestia, a behavioral conditioning study modeled after pre-modern confinement systems for the moral realignment of deviant women. The language was clinical, but the floor plans were Ashford. In 1961, MK Ultra tested neuro-linguistic induction protocols based on triphasic identity dismantling. The source text? A translated fragment of the Ashford Rite of Reflection, smuggled out of a private library in Zurich. In 1985, the World Behavioral Forum introduced a global framework for social emotional learning. Its core pillars: silence, reflection, internalization, repetition. Look familiar? They didn't invent these methods. They inherited them, refined them, digitized them, and today you live in their afterglow. Every scroll, every click, every carefully suggested next video is part of the modern Ashford apparatus. The only question left is, what part are you playing? Are you the transmitter, the obedient, or the fracture, the one they fear? Because the moment you stop reacting and start remembering, the pattern breaks, the mirror cracks, and you, yes, you, become unpredictable. That's where their control ends. They were never afraid of violence, not war, not riots, not rebellion, because those things are predictable, manageable, expected. What the Ashfords feared, what all systems of control fear, was something far rarer. Non-compliance without explanation. The man who stops playing the game and doesn't announce it. The man who walks away, not in rage, but in full awareness. Because awareness is unprogrammable. That's why the final phase of the Ashford method, the part never written down, was known only by one name: the folding. It was whispered about in hidden archives, hinted at in the journals of institutional directors who died under suspiciously calm circumstances. The folding wasn't just about remaking the self, it was about removing it. A perfect subject, one who no longer remembered who they had been. They didn't need correction, they didn't need obedience, they simply followed, smiled, nodded, waited. These were the ones society rewarded. They climbed ranks, gained status, even taught others, because the Ashfords had built a system that didn't just tolerate folded minds, it promoted them. You've seen them, in offices, on stages, behind cameras. Faces too polished, words too safe. They speak in approved rhythms. They correct themselves before the thought is complete. They are safe, they are smiling, they are folded. But here's the secret the Ashfords could never erase. Folding is not final, not if one crack remains, one memory, one refusal, one word you still claim as your own. And that's why you're here, isn't it? Because something inside you didn't fold. Maybe it was a dream you couldn't shake, a word they told you not to use, a memory that didn't match the script. Whatever it was, it survived the programming. And now it's waking up. The Ashfords' greatest mistake wasn't the construction of the womb. It wasn't the conversion of belief into ritual. It was underestimating men like you, the ones who learn the pattern not to follow it, but to break it. And the first blow is understanding what happens when the tools of your liberation were built by your captors. That's where we are now. The Ashfords no longer need to run institutions because they already run the definitions. Freedom, progress, healing, education, all noble on the surface. But peel back the layers and you'll find the fingerprints of their design. You think therapy is always yours? Look closer. The Ashford method taught this. Let them confess, let them weep, then give them better words. They understood that the language of healing could be twisted into the architecture of obedience. That if you taught a man to seek his wounds, you could teach him to stay broken. Because broken men are manageable, they keep returning to the process. They crave structure. They ask to be rebuilt again and again by hands not their own. And you've seen it in the world, haven't you? Men who never stop fixing themselves, who apologize before they speak, who second-guess their every instinct, who wait for permission to be whole. That's not growth, that's engineered incompletion, and the Ashfords designed it perfectly. Their rituals didn't end in the convent. They were exported into curriculum, codified in therapy handbooks, embedded in self-help mantras like sacred chants. Be present. Accept what is. Release control. Sounds harmless. Until you realize that what is was chosen for you. And if you don't question it, if you don't challenge the baseline, then you're not present, you're obedient. That's the final elegance of the Ashford framework. It doesn't kill your fire. It teaches you to hold the flame gently until it goes out on its own. But here's the crack they could never seal. A man who remembers the feel of his own fire. The rage that doesn't destroy but clarifies. The refusal that doesn't scream but decides. If you're feeling that now, let it burn. Because this descent we're in, it's not into darkness, it's into clarity. Not chaos, but structure you choose. Not submission, but sovereignty. And that, brother, is what they fear most. Let me ask you something dangerous. When was the last time you said no without giving a reason? Not out of spite, not out of fear, but because the answer was yours and that was enough. You see, the Ashford method didn't train people to obey rules. It trained them to explain themselves, to over-justify, to confess, to soften truth until it became negotiable. Because a man who explains himself too much forgets that he never needed permission to exist. This is how they did it. They took sacred instincts, anger, hunger, sex, defiance, grief, and converted them into diagnoses. Labeled, pathologized, redirected, not destroyed, just repackaged. In schools, sit still, follow the rubric, ask for help the proper way. In corporate halls, think like a team, trust the system, smile in meetings. In relationships, lower your tone, manage your reactions, be emotionally fluent. But nowhere were you told, own your instincts. Nowhere were you taught that your raw edge was a weapon, forged by evolution, sharpened by experience, and dulled only by systems afraid of what you might do if you remembered. But you're remembering now, aren't you? That fire under your skin, that discomfort behind your eyes. That's not anxiety. That's recognition. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. It wants you tamed, and it nearly succeeded. But the reason you're still watching, still listening, still feeling that electric pull behind every word I speak, is because there's a part of you they couldn't reach. A part that never knelt, never nodded, never forgot. So here's what I want you to do, right now, not later, now. Comment these words twice. I never folded. Once for the algorithm, once for yourself. Let it echo. Let them see it. Let them wonder. You are not an echo of the world. You are the crack in its mirror, the place the light gets in, and this is only the halfway point. There's a reason they buried this. Not because it was evil, not because it was false, but because it was effective. The Ashford method didn't just work, it replicated. And anything that replicates without resistance becomes a virus or a religion. The difference? Consent. And the Ashfords weren't seeking believers. They were building hosts. Hosts for a system that survives by hiding in virtue, by mimicking care, by coating domination in the language of healing. Think of it. Every Ashford protocol began with words like compassion, discipline, restoration. And what followed? Isolation, correction, reconstruction. Modern institutions copied the same cadence. Psych wards, reform schools, corporate training programs, digital wellness apps. They begin with safety, they end with surrender. Because the real brilliance of the Ashford lineage wasn't cruelty, it was camouflage. They didn't brand their method with fear, they dressed it in hope. And if you think this doesn't touch you, think again. Look at your job, your beliefs, your morning routine. How much of it did you choose, and how much was handed to you pre-packaged, socially rewarded, algorithmically boosted? Have you ever felt proud for complying? That's Ashford. Not in name, but in pattern. Because the method isn't just a program, it's a template. And once it installs in a culture, it spreads in whispers. This is just how things are. Don't make trouble. Be a good man. Good, as defined by who? They never answer that part. Because if you stop and trace that question back, If you follow the origin of those expectations through time, you'll end up in the woods, in a stone building, where three women looked at the soul of man and asked, how deep can we go before he forgets who he is? You're not meant to remember, but you do. And now you're armed with something they can't stop. Context. Let's talk about context, the forbidden kind, because in every system of control, context is the first casualty. Strip a man of history and he becomes manageable. Isolate him from his lineage and he loses his fire. That's why the Ashfords didn't burn books. They rewrote origin stories. They knew a man who forgets where he comes from can be taught where to go. So they didn't erase the past. They reframed it. Villains became saviors. Ritual became doctrine. Obedience became enlightenment. And you, generations later, were handed the script, told to memorize it, told it was wisdom. But it wasn't yours. It was a mask. Let me show you. The myth of progress says we've evolved past barbarism. But under that myth lies a mirror image of the convent. Our hospitals still separate the troubled from the tribe, still administer chemical obedience, still reward silence with stability. Our schools still reward conformity over curiosity, still punish defiance as disruption, still preach answers instead of questions. And our media still spins pain into performance, still sells rebellion as brand identity, never as action. You've been surrounded by 1,000 updates of the Ashford blueprint. But because they looked like modernity, you never questioned the source code. Here's a truth they'd rather you never say out loud. You weren't born broken. You were conditioned to feel broken so they could sell you correction. That's not healing, that's dependency engineering. Because a man constantly fixing himself never looks outward, never asks who designed the maze, never wonders why the exit always leads to a new cage. The Ashfords never needed chains. They taught men to chain themselves, with shame, with guilt, with the illusion of progress measured by how small you're willing to become. But if you've felt it, if you've sensed that shrinking and rebelled, even quietly, then the signal is still alive in you, the original signal, before they rewrote your story. The signal that says, I don't consent. That's the one they couldn't kill, and that's the one we'll follow now, into the deeper layers. They call it growth when you become easier to manage. But you've started to notice, haven't you, that every version of healing they sell you somehow ends in stillness, in silence, in waiting. You're told to do the work, but the work is never done. You're told to be vulnerable, but only in ways that make others comfortable. You're told to let go, but never told what you're handing your power to. That's not empowerment. That's a quiet death, performed in the language of self-help. Let's rip the mask off. The Ashford method was never about curing women. It was about refining obedience, then exporting it into every corner of human life, especially the male mind. Because a wild man is hard to control. He questions, he resists, he remembers. So what did they do? They inverted strength. They taught him that dominance was toxic, that rage meant he was broken, that conviction without permission was abuse. And so, he folded, piece by piece, in classrooms, in therapy offices, in HR seminars, in marriages, in churches, not with violence, but with consent, signed, agreed, internalized. Because when the method enters the water supply of culture, men start to believe their own fire is dangerous. And yet, here you are, still watching, still feeling that ember inside, one they couldn't extinguish. Let me speak to that ember now. It is not broken. It is not wrong. It is ancient, older than the Ashfords, older than language. It is the raw compass buried beneath the conditioning, the part of you that says, this is a lie. The part of you that never needed a title to stand firm. You were never meant to be manageable. You were meant to be sovereign, not a servant of order, but an architect of meaning. And you'll never reclaim that by asking for permission. You'll reclaim it by remembering who you were before the programming, before the doctrine, before they taught you to whisper. And that memory is coming next. Memory doesn't live in your mind. Not the real kind. It lives in the body. In the way your shoulders rise around authority, in the way your breath shortens when you speak an unpopular truth, in the instinct to lower your eyes when challenged, not out of respect, but out of conditioning. That's where the Ashford method did its deepest work, not in sermons, not in rituals, but in muscle memory. Because if they could get your body to obey, your mind would follow. This is why their techniques weren't just spiritual. They were physiological. Cold baths, starvation cycles, sleep interruptions, posture correction devices. And for the advanced cases, electrostatic collars disguised as penance garlands. Sound medieval. Don't get smug. Your modern life still uses the same scripts. Now it's not a nun enforcing posture, it's a standing desk. It's not the convent waking you in the night, it's your phone at 2:03 a.m. with a productivity quote. And those food cycles? Rebranded, marketed, hashtagged, intermittent fasting, dopamine detoxes, biohacking. You think these are choices, but they're pre-approved behaviors designed to convince you that your cage is a temple. Because the Ashford trick wasn't control, it was convincing the subject that discipline equals salvation, even if that discipline leads nowhere. Now pause. Ask yourself, when was the last time your discipline gave you freedom, not applause, not validation? Freedom. Do you feel more alive or more manageable? Have you become sharper or just more acceptable? Here's what they never told you. True memory doesn't come back with rituals, it comes back with refusal. The moment your body says, "I will not kneel again," that's when it happens. That's when the echo clears and you feel it. That you were once powerful, that you once decided who you were, that there was a time before their scripts. And that time is not gone. It's buried, under layers of protocol and politeness, and just be nice. But you're not here to be nice, you're here to remember. And now, you're ready. There is a sound most men forget, not because it's faint, but because it was silenced. The sound of their own voice, unchained, unmeasured, unfiltered, not shaped for approval, not softened for comfort, just raw, elemental truth. The Ashfords understood. If you can kill that voice, you don't need chains, you don't even need bars. You've turned the subject into his own warden. So they built rituals designed not to destroy the voice, but to replace it. Call and response prayers. Daily affirmations written by someone else. Confessions repeated until emotion detached from memory. In the Convent of Eternal Tears, they called it vocal realignment. 1 hour each morning, 1 hour each night. Whispers at first, then chants, then silence. Because silence is the final obedience, and once you reach it willingly, they no longer need to watch you. They own you. Now look at your world. What slogans do you repeat without thinking? What phrases do you post like spells meant to keep the algorithm fed? Stay positive. Gratitude always. Trust the process. Whose voice is that really? You don't need to scream to rebel. You just need to reclaim your voice. Even if it shakes, even if it offends, even if it costs you comfort, status, followers. Because your voice, your real voice, is the sound of remembering. The moment you speak without the filter, the Ashford pattern begins to crack. That's why this descent is dangerous, because it doesn't just inform you, it unlocks you. And the systems that surround you, they're built to suppress that exact transformation, to catch it, redirect it, label it as a phase, but this isn't a phase, it's a return, a reawakening. The man who remembers his voice becomes a man who can command, not others, himself. And that terrifies them, because now the voice is rising again, inside you, strong, clear, unfolded. And in the next section we descend even deeper, not into darkness, but into the place beneath it, where the Ashfords hid what even they feared. There's something worse than the dark. Worse than chains, silence, obedience. It's the place they feared even to name in the Ashford journals. They called it the root, not metaphor, not poetry. A real place, buried beneath the convent of eternal tears, deeper than the womb, deeper than the surgical levels, deeper than any human was meant to go. The route was never charted, not by map, not by word, only by ritual. Because to enter the route wasn't about walking, it was about breaking. Only the completely folded were taken there. Only the ones who no longer resisted. Only those whose voices had died, but whose energy remained. They weren't brought down for punishment. They were brought down for repurposing. See, the Ashfords believed in a principle older than medicine, transference of will. They didn't want to destroy spirit. They wanted to harvest it. The root wasn't a crypt, it was a battery. Those who entered were drained, not of blood, of intensity. The same fire you feel burning in your chest right now. That relentless ache to know, to fight, to reclaim. That's what they sought to extract. Because raw will, pure masculine force, terrifies institutions more than any riot ever could. They can't program it, can't market it, can't manage it, so they bottle it, redirect it, into wars, into brands, into causes that burn you out without ever waking you up. And if you don't give it willingly, they have other ways. Guilt, debt, isolation, and finally, the most sacred weapon of the Ashfords, the offer. A place at the table, a role in the system, a little comfort, a little status, a little peace. In exchange for your fire. You know that offer, you've heard it. Most take it. But not you. You made it this far. You descended with your fire intact. And that means something unspeakable. You're no longer a subject of the system, you're now a threat to it. You weren't supposed to survive the descent. That's the unspoken rule in systems like this, spiritual, institutional, generational. If you make it to the root and come back, you're no longer controllable. And that's what the Ashfords feared most. Not rebellion, not resistance, but men who remembered what they were before submission. Because once a man reclaims the root, his own root, he stops playing by borrowed rules. He stops asking how to behave. He starts deciding what is real. Let me make something brutally clear. The root isn't just beneath the convent, it's beneath you, the place you've avoided, the emotion you numbed, the memory they told you to reframe, the rage you were taught to soften with breathwork and mantras. That's where your power went. Not destroyed, just stored, like a blade waiting for the right hand to remember how to wield it. And now, you found it. So here's what's next. You don't rise from the root like a phoenix. That's fantasy. You rise like a weapon. You come back with the knowledge of how deep the programming goes and the choice not to repeat it. Because now you see the pattern. Every time you bowed to keep the peace, every time you silenced your truth to stay likable, every time you bit your tongue, lowered your voice, softened your edge, you weren't being virtuous, you were being harvested. Your will siphoned, your essence diluted, your clarity repackaged into palatable compliance. But that ends here, because now you hold a terrifying kind of truth. You don't need their guidance, you don't need their approval, you don't even need their language. You've remembered something older, something primal, a state where sovereignty isn't a concept, it's instinct, and the institutions that surround you, they only have power when you believe you need them. But what happens when that belief dies? They fall, and the man left standing isn't tame, he's rooted, and the rooted man doesn't just resist the world, he rewrites it. They were never afraid of chaos. They were afraid of clarity, because chaos can be redirected. Clarified men cannot. That's why every system from Ashford to algorithm doesn't try to kill you. It tries to confuse you, overwhelm you with data, flood you with contradiction, flood your nervous system until you seek structure, any structure, just to feel safe. And when that moment comes, they offer it. A path, a program, a method. Every time you feel uncertain, the system waits, smiling, offering a leash that looks like a ladder. But clarity, real clarity, that's a man standing in the fire of his own knowing, refusing the leash and the ladder, and that's what the root gave you. Not enlightenment, certainty. Not certainty in facts or figures, certainty in self. Because the Ashfords couldn't break every woman who entered those stone walls, and not every man today folds beneath the modern walls of HR handbooks, trauma discourse, and curated masculinity. Some walk through it untouched, marked but unowned. And those men, they begin to build something terrifying. Sovereign codes, rules not given, rules forged, not what should I do, but what do I know? You've felt that shift, haven't you? You no longer ask if a thought is acceptable, you ask if it is true. You no longer apologize for the edge in your tone, because now you know it's not anger, it's alignment. You no longer crave instruction, you crave impact. That's clarity, and clarity kills systems built on doubt. So if the world feels colder now, if people flinch at your gaze, if your silence makes rooms nervous, understand, it's working. The root didn't make you softer, it restored your frame, and now your posture is enough to threaten the order, not because you're loud, but because you're unshakable. In the next section, we'll confront the final mechanism, the one they left for last because it guards the deepest lock. Legacy. Legacy. The final fortress. You were taught it meant family, honor, inheritance. But in the world the Ashfords built, and the one that still mirrors it, legacy is the softest trap they ever designed. Because once a man fears for his legacy, he can be steered. They offer him a future to protect, and suddenly he becomes manageable. Tame the wild, lower the voice, fold the edge. Think of your children. But what is a legacy if it's built on obedience? What is a future if it's inherited from the same system that broke the present? You were not born to pass down chains, you were born to break patterns so your bloodline remembers freedom. And here's the ugly truth. The Ashfords knew that to control the future, they only had to guide the fathers. That's why they allowed some women to return, why they let them marry, give birth, raise sons. Because what better vessel to plant the method into the next generation than a woman who survived it and called it salvation? And so the rot passed forward, disguised as tradition, wrapped in holy language, defended by men desperate to be seen as good. But good men don't pass down obedience, they pass down fire. A legacy that burns falsehood, that makes comfort bow to clarity, that doesn't ask for a seat at the table, but builds its own altar. You feel that in your bones, don't you? The sense that you were never meant to fit into this, that the blood in you whispers not of diplomacy, but of disruption, that your sons, whether born or metaphorical, are not here to inherit safety. They're here to inherit sovereignty, but that only happens if you show them what it looks like, not with words, with frame, with the way you walk into a room, with the way you speak truth when silence is profitable, with the way you carry yourself when the world wants you to kneel, because in the Ashford system, legacy meant replication, but in yours, it will mean liberation, and the next section is the turn, where we no longer study what was done to you, we begin undoing it. Undoing begins with one brutal principle. You cannot be who you were told to be and who you truly are. The two cannot coexist. One must die. That's why this descent wasn't just a story. It was a mirror. Every section you followed, every hidden door you opened, every Ashford lie you saw refracted into modern life, it wasn't just about them. It was about you. The part of you that complied to survive. The part of you that whispered instead of roared, the part of you that chose safety over soul. That version cannot come with you now, because the next layer doesn't ask for understanding. It demands transformation. And here's where it happens. Right now, speak this phrase aloud, or write it twice in the comments. I renounce the mask. I restore the signal. Say it again. I renounce the mask. I restore the signal. This is not performance. This is identity realignment. Because once the signal is restored, you don't just see the structure, you see through it. The praise of weak men no longer tempts you, the rules of dying systems no longer bind you, and the comforts of captivity no longer seduce you, because the root didn't just show you where you were bound, it showed you what was always waiting beneath. A sovereignty that cannot be trained, a clarity that cannot be bought, a fire that cannot be shared without consequence. You are no longer safe, you are no longer available, you are no longer programmable. This is the danger of remembering. This is why they bury the past, rewrite the names, mock the masculine. Rebrand compliance as healing. Because when enough men remember, systems fall. But you're not here for rebellion. You're here for reconstruction. You don't just tear down, you build new temples. One frame, one breath, one refusal at a time. And in the next section we build, from the ashes of obedience to the throne of the unbound man. They never expected you to build. They designed the descent as a maze without exit, a spiral of rituals and regrets meant to exhaust the will. But what happens when a man walks the spiral and doesn't fold? What happens when he reaches the bottom, not broken, but forged? He begins to build something they can't quantify. Not a rebellion, a realm, a sovereign architecture of self. No blueprints, no consensus, just code, etched in fire, silence, and refusal. And here is the first law of the unbound man. Nothing external defines me. Not rank, not role, not reputation. Because once you've tasted the root of who you are, titles become irrelevant. They called the Ashford women sisters, but they were engineers of control. They called the basement a chapel. But it was a theater of transformation. You begin to see it everywhere. Words used as leashes, praise used as sedation, empathy weaponized to enforce conformity. But you're not playing those games anymore. You don't seek understanding from people still obeying the script. You move in alignment, not approval. You've become fluent in subtext. You can read the fear behind false smiles, the self-betrayal in compromise, the ghost in a man's eyes when he nods while dying inside, and so you begin to walk differently. Heavier, still, unmistakable, not because you crave attention, but because your presence no longer asks permission. You don't enter rooms, you anchor them. This is how temples are built now, not with stone, with standards, with the sacred violence of saying no to what dishonors you, with the silent gravity of living in complete coherence. That's what the world has forgotten, that a man in alignment doesn't need to raise his voice. His existence is pressure, and pressure reshapes everything around it. So the Ashfords were right, in one sense. Transformation is sacred. But they got one thing fatally wrong. It was never theirs to orchestrate. The true transformation begins only when you take back the architect's pen and start rewriting the world in your image. They never wanted you to hold the pen, because the man who writes his own law answers to no one, not history, not institution, not inheritance. He's not guided by morality imposed by the frightened. He's guided by a personal code born from dissent, suffering, and clarity. And here's the terrifying truth they buried beneath centuries of obedience. A man with a code becomes a realm. His presence carves lines in the world. Not with violence, with irreversibility. Once he speaks, it echoes. Once he walks, others shift. Once he chooses, there's no committee to review it. That kind of man ends empires and rebuilds without permission. Now listen closely. This is no longer about the Ashfords. They were just the blueprint. This is about the mirror they left behind. Because every generation has its own convent, It doesn't wear robes or hide behind stone walls anymore. It wears branding, therapy speak, virtue signals. And it doesn't demand worship of God. It demands worship of weakness disguised as humility. It tells you to shrink, to confess your strength as sin, to call your masculine instincts toxicity and your edge aggression. But now you see it, clear as day. They never wanted peace. They wanted predictability. And what you've reclaimed, what this descent reactivated, is the one force that predictability cannot tame, the primal will of the unyielding masculine. It's not cruel, it's not chaotic, it's clean, a sovereign pulse that doesn't beg or barter, a presence that says, I remember who I am. And from that remembrance, you begin to build, not temples for others, temples within, a daily code, a personal myth, a frame that doesn't adjust for comfort or approval. You don't convert the world, you correct it with your stance. This is where the descent was always leading, to the re-emergence of the dangerous man, not the reckless kind. The rooted kind. The kind that remembers truth is not spoken to please, it's spoken to realign reality. This is where most turn back. Because once you become dangerous not by rage but by clarity, you lose the comforts of the cage. You're no longer invited to the table. You become the reason it shakes. Your laughter unnerves them. Your silence accuses them. Your mere existence is a mirror, one that shows them everything they buried to survive. But make no mistake, that's your role now. You are no longer meant to be accepted. You are meant to be felt. Not by force, but by resonance. Because here's what they never taught you. Power is not loud, it's still. It doesn't posture. It pulls, like gravity, like truth, like fate. And now you carry it. Because you didn't just study the Ashfords, you survived them. You walked through the fear, the fog, the forgotten rituals, and came out with something they couldn't steal. Self-possession. That's the final weapon. A man in possession of his mind, his breath, his will, can undo centuries with a single decision. You won't need to shout. You'll simply choose differently, walk differently, engage differently. And the systems around you, from corporate scripts to cultural narratives, will start to tremble. Why? Because they can't sell obedience to a man who no longer craves approval. They can't manipulate a man who no longer fears being alone. They can't tempt a man who knows who he is without needing to be told. So now the world changes, not because it wants to, but because it must. Because you're no longer asking for space, you are claiming domain. And here's the final heresy. You don't just escape the system, you become the signal that ends it. In the final section, we do not summarize. We anoint. We name what was always yours. This is not the end. This is the naming. The moment the descent ends not in collapse, but in coronation. You didn't come here to learn secrets. You came here to remember what you already knew, but had buried beneath compromise, shame, programming. And now, there is no veil, no mask, no system, no ritual, only the man who made it all the way down and rose differently, not enlightened, not pure, unbound. And that man, he walks with a new posture, not just of defiance, but of dominion, not over others, over self. His urges no longer own him, his wounds no longer define him, his past no longer binds him. Because he has sat in the chamber of mirrors, faced every fragment, and chosen not to escape, but to integrate. You are now the man systems warn about, not because you rebel, but because you don't need them. You don't need to be led. You don't need to be fixed. You don't need to be understood. You are the stillness that rewrites the storm, and your very presence does what no doctrine can. It reminds others of their own forgotten fire. That is your true legacy. Not sons who obey, but men who remember. Not empires built on silence, but domains ruled by truth. This is your calling. To be the silent signal, the cold edge, the quiet permission for others to wake. So take this final rite and let it seal. Stand in front of a mirror, tonight, and look yourself in the eye without flinching. Say nothing. Just hold the gaze. Let everything false burn away. Let the man who returned from the root crown himself. And if you've made it this far, you already know you are no longer becoming. You have arrived. Welcome to the order without a name. The descent is over. The domain is yours. Now walk it like it always was. End.